speakers series with Chap Lawson. Chap has done a really extraordinary range of research on different topics. He's an associate professor of political science at MIT. He's also an award-winning teacher at MIT. I saw having recently won the James and Ruth Levitan Teaching Award. Congratulations, Chap. And his research, I think, one of the things that I find really fascinating about Chap's research is how he followed his curiosity into such different topics. I mean, my kind of first knowledge of Chap's research was as a scholar of the media and democratization in Mexico in particular. And indeed, he's one of the most influential scholars on that topic, working on questions like building a free press in Mexico, looking at TV coverage and its impact on electoral outcomes and democracy in Mexico. But more recently, a lot of his work has followed as sort of his curiosity in other directions, becoming a major influence in really developing a program of studies around Homeland Security. His work is now delving into cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, and as we'll be talking about today, borders and border management. That research has informed and drawn upon his own policy experience. From September 2009 to February 2011, Chap was a political appointee in the Obama administration as executive and to the commissioner, pardon me, of the U.S. Customs and Border Protections, and he also served previously as Director of Inter-American Affairs on the National Security Council, staff during the Clinton administration. He's also been a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and a research fellow for U.S.-Mexico Studies at the University of California. He received his PhD from Stanford University in 1999. I had the opportunity to work with Chap on a project with the Wilson Center called North America 2.0, along with Burst. The work he'll be talking about today is related to his chapter in that project, but will be in particular drawing on some research that he helped lead here with CBTS in a project called Borders of the Future. Again, Chap, it's a real honor to start this year's speaker series with you. The floor is yours.
Gosh, well, I feel very distinguished to be here. Thank you so much. Sometimes one doesn't recognize oneself in introductions, and today is one of those days. I'm very grateful, Tom, to you and to everybody who's on the call. So two preliminaries. I mean, I think for a lot of people, not me, but others, when someone hears there's going to be a presentation on customs operations or ports of the future, their eyes kind of glaze over. So I feel like I'm a little bit in the category of Elizabeth Taylor's Sixth Husband, how to make it interesting. And I have searched and searched for transporting rhetoric, and I think I've struck out. So I apologize if it's a little bit dry. I hope if you become bored, you will simply jump in, either by raising your hand on Teams or just shouting out something. The second preliminary is I just want to get a sense of where people are when it comes to port of entry operations. And I think I can see people's hands, but could you raise your hand if you feel like you're relatively expert in this subject? I'm seeing no hands. Okay. And if you are reasonably well versed on this subject, like at the level of an interested observer, but not an academic expert, are there any people in that category? Okay. Yeah, and then neophytes, people who have not really heard about, thought much about ports of entry or borders of the future in the past. Greg raised his hand for that, which I know is ridiculous. So, well, I'm getting the sense that it's a pretty diverse audience, but I think what I'll do is give a little bit more background than I was originally planning on giving. And again, if something is unclear, please just jump in. Presentations at MIT are normally highly aerobic activities, if not full contact sports. So the fact that I've already spoken for a few paragraphs and no one's interrupted me is utterly unfamiliar. And I hope you guys will do so if you want. So what I'll do is just give a little bit of background on the topic, then talk about what we did in this particular project, what we found, and tiny bit at the end on what we hope to do in the future. So by way of background, ports of entry or POEs are there for really four purposes. I mean, they are to reconcile the need for flows of people and cargo across sovereign international borders with the notion of sovereign state authority. So to take advantage of economic complementarities produced by globalization and travel opportunities produced by airplane travel and other modes, with the need for states to secure the flows of goods and people coming into their country. And this includes, as I suggested, both people and cargo. And it spans a wide range of modes, as I'm indicating here, and I hope the visual is clear, but it could be ferries and cruise ships. It could be people at JFK's International Terminal, people coming in on private jets at International General Aviation, tiny ports of entry with a few people crossing per year, as in the Alaska-Canada border, or hugely busy ports of entry like the Ambassador Bridge, or shown here, the El Paso Juarez Bridge of the Americas. Enormous seaports with dozens of gantry cranes unloading boxes of containerized cargo at, say, one box per minute, a rapid rate that could be entirely automated without any human intervention, all the way to a couple people with a pallet of bananas hauling it off of a ship, or a highly specialized port like the Federal Buque between Mobile, Alabama, and Coatzacoalcos, Mexico, which is just simply a roll-on, roll-off ship with carrying train parts and train cars. Anyway, this enormous diversity and heterogeneity, especially when it comes to seaports. And then on the government side, the entity in the United States charged with administering these ports of entry is U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which also administers through the Border Patrol the areas between the ports of entry and the littorals. But we're going to focus here on CBP's operations at the ports of entry, which is the responsibility of its Office of Field Operations, or OFO. And in managing these border operations at ports of entry, CBP and other customs organizations face this classic problem of how to both secure flows of goods and people across the border while also facilitating lawful trade and travel. And the analogy that's frequently used is needles in haystacks. So there's an enormous amount of lawful trade and travel, and what is illegitimate or illegal is a tiny fraction of that. So even at, say, the US land border with Mexico, theoretically the locus of massive undocumented immigration and smuggling, 99% of all flows are entirely, quote, kosher. That is compliant with every regulation in the United States. And that means that it's very difficult for customs agencies to find the bad things in this much larger sea of, quote, good things. And that has really been the challenge for the United States after 9/11. Before the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, the regime was pretty haphazard. Immigration controls were highly imperfect. Inspection of cargo was hardly perfect as well. Often lots of cargo wasn't inspected. And then all of a sudden there was this massive focus on security. And that regime really grew out of the fact that after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the border was effectively shut. It wasn't officially shut, but supply chains were highly disrupted, as were international travel networks. And the United States had to find a way to revamp its border management system to ensure that bad people, like terrorists, weren't getting in, that bombs in boxes were not floating to the port of Long Beach on massive cargo containers, at the same time exploiting all the potential benefits of globalization. And this regime was incredibly successful in some ways, but limited in other ways. So first, I'll just describe the strategies and then the limitations and successes. So the main strategies that the United States CBP created in the wake of the 2001 terrorist attacks and its peer organizations has been to segment flows of goods and people by risk. That is to try to identify the riskiest shipments and the riskiest individuals and single them out for greater law enforcement action while pulling out of the system all the straw that we know is very unlikely to be risky or non-compliant. And there's a series of strategies that I think have now become accepted practice across customs organizations. So whitelisting, things like global entry, or Sentry or Nexus, trusted and vetted traveler programs. The equivalent on the trade side with CTPAT, so trusted shippers and manufacturers and importers and exporters. And the idea there is that these people shouldn't come in for much law enforcement attention, and rather enforcement resources and inspection resources should be devoted to the riskier shipments. Simultaneously with whitelisting, there's also blacklisting, as putting people on watch lists or flagging particular companies as potential fronts or potentially dangerous in some other way. And then in addition to whitelisting and blacklisting, using the information that is available to customs authorities, especially in this case, US CBP, to try to identify through law enforcement targeting potentially risky shipments that don't fall into either the whitelist category or the blacklist category. And finally, using new inspection technologies, whether it's non-intrusive inspection that allows customs agents to look inside a box, or backscatter images that allows people to be searched through millimeter wave technologies, searched at scale, but much more effectively than they could be before. And so those four strategies together really comprise the post 9/11 regime. And this regime has been incredibly successful in dealing with counterterrorism. So since 9/11, very few, if any, of the terrorist attacks or attempted terrorist attacks on US soil have been the product of people who snuck into the country or got in as clean skins. Almost all have been homegrown terrorists who were radicalized in the United States, either native born or came here from abroad as children, in the case of the Tsarnaev brothers in Boston. And of course, as you know, there's been no bomb in a box. Nothing has blown up at a port of entry as a result of terrorist activity. At the same time, this regime has been limited in some other ways. Arguably, it's bulky. It's sometimes cumbersome to administer. It's very expensive. CBP has 60,000 plus employees and is the world's largest law enforcement agency by dollar volume. And a large number of parcels, packages, containers, et cetera, that come into the United States are not inspected. I'll talk a little bit more about the limitations in a bit, but you should know that the current regime, which I would regard as the post 9/11 creation over the last 2 decades, has both successes and potential limitations in a new era of globalization. And what do I mean in particular by a new era of globalization? I mean that over the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of China and with it a concomitant increase in trade violations. Things like tariff evasion, intellectual property rights violations, violations of forced labor provisions, violations of agricultural provisions, and everything else that we think of as environmental or governance, social sort of restrictions on trade. And the United States government, to this point, hasn't really developed a firm and reliable answer to that issue. How do we find trade violations in this vast flow of goods, especially trade violations that are sourced ultimately in China, and which is our largest trading partner? And trade violations are particularly difficult because unlike regular contraband, say smuggled endangered species or undocumented migrants or drugs, many of the products that are brought in but are violatory of trade restrictions are on their face totally legitimate products. It's only their provenance that makes them problematic. So a bike helmet looks like a bike helmet. It is a bike helmet. The fact that it violates safety regulations is not something that one can see in an image, and possibly not something that someone can even detect immediately by visual inspection. Um, and all kinds of other trade violations fall into these same categories, whether it's honey that has been loaded with artificial sweeteners, products that are labeled as organic but are not, DVDs that are actually pirated, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one set of challenges. Another set of challenges, obviously, was COVID, which not only disrupted global travel networks, but also induced some supply chain disruptions. And these two things have pointed out, I think, the limitations of the post 9/11 regime and the need for a new regime. Concomitantly, in addition to these new challenges, there are a series of new opportunities, mainly as a result of technological development that, in theory, enable a more robust government response to these same challenges. So they include facial recognition technology that allows for processing of individuals at scale, improvements in NII technology, and digitalization of everyday life, including trade, and along with it, development of artificial intelligence programs that can find anomalies in digitalized data, and thus, in theory, improve targeting, identifying the bad needles in the haystack of good stuff. So that's all by way of background and motivation for our project. So what did we do? What is this project to which Greg and Tom have already alluded? Um, First of all, it was a study funded by CBITS, and originally by DHS's Science and Technology Directorate, that would examine all modes. So quite ambitious, both people and cargo in every type of port of entry. It was a 2.5-year project with three overlapping tasks. The first was research, then there was writing. We generated a 45-page report with 80 pages of appendices. But before you hang up the call immediately, there's also a 2-page executive summary for anybody who wishes to read that. And then a good deal of socialization that overlapped with the research and the writing of our findings with both CBP officials, former CBP officials, to make sure that we were covering all the right issues that would be of interest, not just to an academic audience, but to CBP. And the project was really an effort to balance both academic research with an attempt to have real-world policy impact on an important agency wrestling with some significant challenges. In the course of the project, we conducted 82 interviews. Although it's officially over, we're still talking to people. Of these interviews, about 20% were from the field at CBP, 20% were from HQ CBP, about 30% were former officials, and the rest were members of the trade, that is importers, exporters, shippers, et cetera, foreign customs officials, experts in non-intrusive inspection technology and other types of technology, and the like. And we combined these interviews with a bunch of site visits to ports of entry along the U.S.-Mexico border, and extensive interviews and port tours in the United Arab Emirates and Singapore, Australia, ports of Long Beach, Los Angeles, Port of Newark, and a major international general aviation terminal in the United States, Teterboro, New Jersey. Obviously, we reviewed a large number of publications, government and academia, to the extent that there are peer-reviewed publications on these topics. And then we did a deep dive into the research on some specific issues, like the future of non-intrusive inspection technology, management of the COVID pandemic across different countries, what specific ports looked like, what the idiosyncrasies were of different modes, for instance, general aviation. And the project team was 2 people from the Migration Policy Institute who really focused more on the people side of things, and then Alan Burson, my former boss in government, and me, who focused maybe more on the cargo side, although in the end, all of us owned all of the recommendations in the report. And I just want to add a shout out here to the CBITS team. pictured below. Since this was an academic project, I'm not going to bore you with too much detail, but I, I just want to reassure you at least that we did this work to an academic standard of rigor in the tradition of rigorous qualitative methods research. So, for instance, when we were selecting our interviewees, we broke them down into potential categories. Within each category, we had a sampling strategy. So that could be purposive selection, for instance, of all current and former heads of OFO, who we were regarded as creative and effective, and were also accessible and thought to be candid. In some cases, we tried to interview everybody in a particular category, so it was sort of a universal selection strategy. In some cases, it was a random selection from groups of people. And just full disclosure, we did use some convenience sampling where necessary, especially when it came to interviewing people from the trade, like big shippers. And then in terms of picking the sites to visit, forgive the Boolean algebraic terminology and set theory here, but we looked for sites where they were known to be innovative operations globally, where they were recommended by CBP, where they were recommended by interviewees, and they were of the right size. So we had a bias to larger seaports, for instance, over smaller, more specialized seaports, and could not be something that was inaccessible to us. So, for instance, it was impossible to conduct seaport visits and interviews in China, unfortunately. The one place that we didn't get to that we really wanted to was the Netherlands, but we did get to a number of other places. Okay, so that's basically what we did. Now, hopefully the more interesting part, what did we find? We found that the challenge CBP confronts has to do with this post 9/11 shift in supply chains that I alluded to earlier. That a very small percentage of maritime cargo is currently inspected in any way. So if we take out the trusted shippers, which is about 50% of all maritime cargo, 98% of the non-trusted cargo is not inspected. And inspection rates remain pretty low for passenger vehicles, for rail, for trucks, et cetera, but not nearly as low as they are for maritime cargo. So this post 9/11 layered approach still has some holes in it. Secondly, as I mentioned, there are a lot of environmental, social, and governance mandates. And one classic example is the Weaker Forced Labor Prevention Act, UFLPA, which basically forces firms that have deep supply chains in China to go all the way back to the origination of their product and certify it as free of forced labor. So not simply the shirt, but the cloth. And the cloth, the cotton fiber, and then the cotton fiber where the cotton is actually grown. And all of that entire supply chain has to be free of forced labor for a product to be compliant under UFLPA. But UFLPA is just one example of an increasing array of ESG mandates. The Phase 7 of the Lacey Act on wood products, the Enforce Act, lots of other CHIPS Act, lots of other things have this same flavor and have been increasingly important, including, especially for this new administration, the potential imposition of greater tariffs. And in the previous two administrations, Trump 1 and Biden, concerns about tariff evasion for sectors where there has been anti-dumping or countervailing duties levied against firms, mainly manufacturers in China. So that's on the supply chain side. And then on the people side, obviously the response to COVID, but the growing volume of international travel and the increasing amount of irregular movement of people, even through the ports of entry, has been a challenge. Right. And finally, as we talked to people at CBP, it became increasingly clear that the agency, though very mature now, is still wrestling with a day-to-day focus. And that is distracting the attention of senior management who don't have the time that they need to articulate a long-term vision of what ports of the future should be. And I think CBP people can be quite visionary and are doing their best, but if there is constant pressure to deal with undocumented migration or a fentanyl crisis or whatever, naturally that is going to absorb their attention. So the opportunity for real strategic thinking about borders of the future just hasn't been there. So that's the big challenge. Now, what did we come up with in response? Vision on the cargo side, vision on the people side. I'll talk about the cargo side first. Full transparency in supply chains combined with advanced targeting, more sophisticated targeting. What do I mean by that? I mean that firms will have to ultimately surrender information to CBP about where the fish is caught, where the diamond is mined, a sort of UFLPA on steroids across every sector. This will happen gradually. It could happen sector by sector, beginning with those sectors where American private firms are most amenable and fear foreign competition, especially violatory competition. Uh, but ultimately, reaching all firms and all entries into the United States. Um, Greater focus on exit, including export controls, as well as entry, and universal inspection of cargo, usually done by NII at some point in the supply shipment chain. And this may not be hugely comprehensive of all potential species of contraband, but will at least include some level of scrutiny of the physical cargo to make sure that it matches manifest data. And the intermediate step here is a creation of trusted networks, including trusted ports and trusted foreign manufacturers, that where they are securing their own supply lines and they are inspecting their own cargo, and therefore CBP doesn't need to conduct the inspections. But the overall implication here is to recoup state authority over the global supply system, but in the form of a partnership with the private sector, where the private sector furnishes much greater information to CBP in return for expedited processing. And in the case of almost all goods, pre-departure clearance of cargo, meaning that it won't be inspected again when it arrives in the United States, in the case of the overwhelming bulk of goods. Okay, because CBP will have the data necessary to run advanced targeting algorithms and identify potentially risky shipments. Okay, then on the people side, a vision of seamless travel, where people carry electronic passports that allow for touchless, paperless, automated verification of identity and permit smooth movement through the entire system at every stage without the need for multiple interruptions and or queues. People may be revetted or rechecked as they walk through an airport, for instance, but that will be seamless to the traveler. The travel won't necessarily, won't have to queue, won't necessarily know. And that relies on a different approach to privacy, which I can talk about in questions and answers, and also full deployment of automated facial comparison, including technologies that have not quite been developed, but we believe will be developed over the next 10 years. So those are our main findings. And let me go into a tiny bit more detail. I won't talk about everything, but I'm going to compare the current approach to the future approach just to highlight some of the distinctions. So if we think of mission priorities right now for CBP when it comes to people, the focus has been on counterterrorism and undocumented migration. But in the future, we imagine rebalancing CBP's efforts, and we imagine seamless travel. With respect to privacy, there has been this continuing tension between CBP's efforts and the US government effort in general to extract more information on travelers to assess counterterrorism risk, and then a pushback by privacy advocates and others who fear abuse of power by the state. And our solution, we believe, would be much broader government access to a whole range of personally identified data, but with the checks necessary to prove that the government is a good steward of this data, will safeguard its integrity, and that it won't bleed out to the rest of the government. Rather, it'll be used for the particular use case of border management. On data collection, then travelers will have the opportunity to share their data as needed and maybe as they wish, differentially while they pass through a system. And that will be combined, obviously, with biometric recognition through facial recognition. And ultimately, we believe all of this will lead away from primary inspection as the default, that is, travelers interacting directly with agents of CBP, officers from the Office of Field Operations, to road processing being done in automated form and a significant reduction as a result in staffing. Um, we do have some other discussions of migration, asylum claims, and pandemic management that I won't get into. But the basic idea is the same: to use data to then shift road processing away from the physical ports of entry to to places outside of the border. So to avoid congestion at crossing points, at authorized crossing points, ports of entry. Okay, and then on the cargo side, um, how do I capture the way we're approaching the paradigm shift here? Uh, if you ask CBP now or over the last 20 years, what is its role in the economy? Well, its role is to facilitate lawful trade and travel and maybe to a lesser extent collect customs revenue. CBP's customs revenue is a small percentage of overall government revenue collection, but it would pay for 10 national science foundations every year, as well as 3 times CBP's operating budget. But the focus has been on facilitating lawful trade and travel, which in turn contributes to economic growth. We believe instead the future is CBP is an instrument of industrial policy. It is enforcing a managed trade regime that uses tariffs, for instance, to encourage reshoring and to prevent and uses ESG regulations to prevent violations of what the United States regards as important for a robust international trade regime. And as I mentioned, that's going to rely on validated, accurate, comprehensive information on the ultimate source of all elements of a shipment and on the rebuttable presumption of inspection for every parcel, package, container, etc., arriving in the United States. Though CBP will rarely be the one conducting those inspections. Those inspections will be conducted by trusted partners abroad who have engaged in a collaboration with CBP, where CBP sets the standards and the foreign partners comply. Or the private sector partners comply. And finally, private firms in the future should never be asked to provide the same piece of information twice, that they will only provide information once, one time, and that will be used, especially beginning in the context of North America, to move toward a full processed once regime, where if a piece of information is given to the government of Canada, it's shared by the government of Canada with the government of the United States, and there's no need for the United States then to recapitulate the same efforts that the government of Canada made. Okay, so what do we hope to do in the future? I think one challenge is with regard to supply chain transparency is getting the initial tranches of data from the private sector to be as validated as possible so that shippers and manufacturers and members of trusted networks can be identified as trusted, and so that artificial intelligence programs can be trained on accurate data, avoiding the kind of GIGO garbage in, garbage out model, which would happen if we were to use existing customs manifests. Existing customs manifests are often insufficiently informative and sometimes outright false about the data. So there will have to be an enormous push here to validate that data, especially in the beginning, once supply chain data starts pouring into CBP. And there are a number of other issues of systems and technology that will have to be put in place to ensure that CBP can process all this information once it begins to come in. And that, we hope, will be one of the subjects of ongoing research. So that's the basic overview, and I should stop now. I think I was given till 12:40, and we're at 12:39 for questions. And again, please feel free to ask about anything. And if I've gone too rapidly over some subject and used acronyms more freely than I should have, please just ping me. So over to you, Tom.
Great. Thank you so much for that excellent talk. So much there, including some really concrete proposals that we can think about and discuss. I'd encourage everyone to put their question in the chat if you'd like to ask it yourself. I think we should be able to let you do that as well. While we are giving people a chance to gather their thoughts and get them into the chat, let me go ahead and start with a question about the context in a sense. And that's where you started from, this sort of the changing global context, this move away from globalization, which you talked about in terms of the rise of China, but also in terms of the United States adopting a more managed approach to trade and as industrial policy, as you said. I guess I was wondering, in the diagnosis of these changes, how much of this do you see as being about China and Chinese trade policy, Chinese state-led industrial strategy or economic strategy? And how much of this is, in a sense, an almost inevitable or unavoidable result of having really diverse, far-flung, very dynamic supply chains? Because it seems like the
Right.
responses to those two different diagnoses could be quite different. And I'm wondering kind of how you see that environment and how it might condition what the appropriate responses are.
Yeah. So three things. I think I would say, rather than just generally diverse supply chains, I really think there is a major China problem and a desire on the part of policymakers in the United States to decouple the U.S. economy from China, at least to some degree. So that's a huge piece of it. But simultaneously, there's a second piece, which I think is just growing international concern for all kinds of ESG related things, like climate, um, carbon intensive goods. I mean, imagine if there was tomorrow a global carbon tax. How would you enforce that in the context of borders? Right? I mean, there would have to be some way of verifying that the information about the carbon content of different goods was accurate. And the shift toward, I think, away toward a more managed trade approach, not just on behalf of the United States, but other countries too. I mean, Mercosur is an example, even the European Union and certainly China, um, where, for instance, NAFTA was mainly a free trade agreement. USMCA is a managed trade agreement. Uh, it's about rules of origin and it's about tariffs. And then, the use of old industrial policy instruments like tariffs to encourage reshoring, not to really gather revenue for the government. That's not the real purpose of these tariffs. The purpose is to encourage reshoring. And again, that's not just China, but it's Asian supply chains that have a Chinese nexus to them almost always. So I think it's this combination of like a new set of issues on the global agenda, the global policy agenda, that have implications for the trade agenda, like environmental concerns being one of them, forced labor being another, et cetera, with a desire to decouple from China. And then, finally, a desire to reshore, which maybe isn't entirely specific to China, but is again relevant for China. So that's my take. And I just want to emphasize, I don't know that the incoming administration has fully focused on this, but if the goal is to encourage reshoring through tariffs, whether it's anti-dumping countervailing duty tariffs or just broader tariffs across the board, that strategy can only work if those tariffs are enforced. And that means we have to have a mechanism for enforcing the tariffs that we don't currently have, right? In the context of lack of information and lack of accurate information about the ultimate provenance of different elements of each shipment, we simply can't evaluate whether a shipment is violatory. And all the targeting in the world won't work if the manifest data is crappy to begin with, right? So we do need a new paradigm here. And I, whether you agree with the strategy of industrial policy for the purposes of reshoring and using these tariff instruments to do it or not, I think you have to recognize that if you're gonna use that strategy, you need a different approach to enforcement. That's where the rubber really meets the road. And that is going to require accurate data on supply chains. And so as I mentioned, I'm not sure the new administration, which has a big focus on exactly this issue, has cottoned to the question of um, enforcement of tariffs and enforcement of other types of violations. And the problem is probably even bigger than it has been heretofore, uh, because for some goods, I mean, I think of certain metals and certain electronic components, a 300% tariff is not going to be sufficient to make American domestic production competitive with China, right? I mean, and the higher that tariff is, the greater the temptation, the greater the incentive for smuggling, right? So the government is going to have to adjust massively and rapidly if this is the new goal of American industrial policy, right? And
Right.
I just, like I said, I don't know that everybody has really focused on this, but they're going to have to if they want it to work.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, very much kind of where the rubber meets the road. We have a couple of questions in the chat and one hand up. Catherine Hefner, I don't know if you want to ask your question out loud, or if I can
I mean,
go ahead and ask. But Catherine asked about if there had been collaboration with the Coast Guard on this. And I'm not sure whether that means the research in particular or kind of what the role of the
yeah,
Coast Guard would be. But if you kind of had any insights from the project
yeah.
regarding the Coast Guard.
No, that's an important question. So obviously, CBP to do its job has to collaborate with lots of parts of the government, including Coast Guard and TSA. But CBP is charged with enforcing the law of regulations from 47 different agencies. So it has lots of partners in the U.S. government as well as partners in the trade and foreign government. One of the most important partnerships with the Coast Guard has to do with seaports. So what comes into a seaport is determined by the Coast Guard, the captain of the port. And that means the vessels have to be seaworthy, they have to come in at the right time, et cetera. And that's the Coast Guard's job. And then once the vessel is docked, CBP takes over. So anything about unloading the vessel and getting it turned around, that's on CBP. But obviously, that collaboration has to be seamless. So we did talk to some people in the Coast Guard and to CBP people about the relationship with the Coast Guard. In general, I think that partnership is strong, and that's been working really well. I think they're very clearly defined bureaucratic lanes and close collaboration. So for instance, just as an example, the port of Long Beach, I think it's the port of Long. No, it's Newark. Um, the incident command center is shared by the Coast Guard and CBP. So if there was a crisis, it would be the same people from both agencies in one place. And it's actually, I think, that CBP is maintained by the Coast Guard. So that's good. The TSA collaboration is also very strong. Obviously, there has to be a handoff when people are flying into the country. They have an international leg to their flight, and then they have a domestic leg to their flight. And the levels of inspection should be similar. So that I think is also quite strong. Where collaborations have been, and then with USFDA on agricultural commodities, I think there's good collaboration. Um, where the collaboration has been, but really needs some work, I think, is on the public health side. And that we saw that with COVID, but the public health authorities don't really necessarily want anything to do with the border, and who's in charge and who's running the show and who's communicating and who's setting policy has been a little bit more opaque. Well, bigger answer than the Coast Guard, but please follow up if there was something specific about the Coast Guard.
Yeah, great. Thank you. If you have a follow-up, let us know, Catherine. Otherwise, we'll move along to a question from Susitra in the chat. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I greatly appreciate the insights. I'm curious to know how comfortable companies are in sharing supplier data to assess for any indications of child labor or forced labor within their supply chains.
Right. So that's a great question. Nobody wants to share this data, right? And ultimately, they won't do it unless they're forced to, right? So there has to be some element of fiat regulation to make the new system work. At the same time, some private sector partners are much more comfortable than others. And if you think of, fashion forward brands or brands that cater to young people, there's a high sensitivity to making sure that there isn't child labor or forced labor or even environmental damage when built into their supply chains. And they're more apt to work with CBP and much more comfortable sharing data. And then there are industries that, aluminum, steel, copper, et cetera, where there are US competitors that feel like they're being undercut by foreign firms shipping violatory goods, like getting around tariffs. And they are very amenable to sharing their supplier data if the United States will also make those other firms, their competitors abroad, share the supplier data, right? So it does vary by sector. Um, and then I think, firms will be quite willing to share data if they see the ultimate benefit of pre-departure clearance. So a t-shirt company based in Asia will know that when the container is sealed and it's put on a ship, that container won't be opened at the border. In fact, it might not even be open until it hits a department store in New York City, right? Because it's already been vetted. And I think that is what the trade is increasingly demanding. They want that pre-departure clearance. So I think there's trade space there. Um, the UFLPA failed on one dimension, or succeeded from a policy perspective, perhaps, but failed in terms of partnership with the private sector, is it didn't give companies sufficient time to collect the data from their suppliers. So they might only have known one step back in their supply chains, but they were being asked to collect data on supply chains that might go 13 levels deep in China, right? And they simply didn't have the information. So this has to be phased in. Firms have to have the time to ask their suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers to collect the data and then pass it on. And then there has to be a process of validation, right? And all that has to be phased into any regulation. Otherwise, I think the private sector, the trade will go crazy, and justly so, right? So it'll vary by sector, it'll vary by type of company, sort of market for the goods, and it'll vary by the way in which the policy is implemented. Yeah. And this applies, you
Yeah.
mentioned child labor and forced labor, but it's going to be the same for any kind of environmental goods too. Was this palm oil produced from a plantation that clear cut the rainforest and killed all the orangutans? Was this beef from a place where the rainforest was devastated and then cows were grazing there? All that information, I think, has to be shared ultimately for this new system of trade regulation to work.
Great, thank you. I have, I'd love to get some questions about that process of verification, because of course that getting the information is one thing, chasing it back and verifying is a harder question, perhaps. We have a hand
Phase
up
two.
from
Yeah.
yeah, from Michelle Lefati. Do you want to ask your question directly?
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation. We have a project ongoing with CBTS on asylum optimization. So I am also interested to see that do you suggest any certificate from Harvard, MIT in this area, like Homeland Security leadership or public policy, or do you teach in any of these programs? Because we need to have more domain knowledge when we do data analytics. So I would love to allocate some part of my grants in this area to educate ourselves and get certificate. You have any suggestion?
It's a great question. I mean, as Tom and I have been fighting an uphill battle within the discipline of political science to get the discipline to take all these issues seriously. And I don't teach a course on any of these things, unfortunately. And there are very few people in political science or public administration who do. And then the ones who do don't always really understand CBP because it is a hermetic organization. It's very complex. I wish I could give you better news, but I'm happy to chat to your students if that's useful.
Thank you.
Great. We have a question from Holly in the chat as well. She said she joined late, so apologies if you covered this early, but is there any work with the CBP's green trade strategy? And if so, were there any
Yeah.
follow-up on the Innovation and Incentives Forum? Or
Yeah.
other plans for that. And maybe I'll loop in, we're getting all the questions here at the end. Loop in, add one more question to that, which is, has CBTS considered the future of ports of entry infrastructure, given their decades-long service span? So a bit more on the infrastructure side. How can government effectively plan for emerging technologies, policies, and procedures that may necessitate additional space and impose new restrictions in the years ahead.
So do we have about 5 minutes left? Is that correct, or do we
Yeah,
finish at
we started a
12:55?
bit late, so if you have time, we can go over by a couple minutes, but we don't want to run
Okay.
too much
Um,
beyond that. But yeah.
So yes, on the green trade strategy, but the green trade strategy, I think, comprehends something broader than just whether products are quote, green or have a certain carbon content or whatever. That it also comprehends, like emissions at ports, as I understand it. But we did talk to those people, and right now that is not necessarily the focus of the next step of work, but it could be. Greg is the guy to Greg, if Greg tells us it's the focus of the next step, then that'll probably be the focus of the next step. So, yeah, I can share the slide deck. In terms of ports of entry infrastructure, yeah, so this was a huge problem under the old system because the ports of entry infrastructure were aging, and not just the ports of entry themselves, but all the infrastructure leading into the ports of entry. I mean, you might have this ultra modern thing on the US side, ultra modern thing on the Mexican side, but then the traffic dumps into, a windy dirt road. And so you still have huge backups at the port of entry, even though the POE itself is very modern. I think under the new regime, this is all going to be much less of a problem, right? Because so much of the road operation should be taken out of the system and should not be happening at the physical border, right? I mean, there is a problem with passenger vehicles, and I think with pedestrians on the land borders, that's always going to be an issue. But in terms of clogging up the border crossing points and the infrastructure associated with them, if you've removed a lot of the processing stuff, taken it offline, then what happens at the border will be much more seamless, right? So I even spoke to somebody at CBP who said, like Congress asked us, do we need a lot more money to modernize all our ports on the southwest border, on the Canadian border? And yeah, like the Ambassador Bridge, that needs some work. But in general, the answer is probably no if you adopt our vision. But that's not where the investment needs to be. The investment needs to be in the systems and the technologies behind the scenes. Which I know sounds counterintuitive, but I'm pretty convinced that that's the right answer. Global registry, no, this was floated. I see Penny's question. This was floated. This idea of an international repository. I think it was Chertoff who originally floated it at DHS, and I think that's not going to happen. I think it's going to happen at CBP, but there will be allied trusted governments. I'm thinking of the British, the Dutch, the Australians, et cetera, who may contribute or share to the extent possible. But I don't think we've gone in the direction of a vetted international repository. There's just too many sovereignty questions and too many questions about companies not wanting their data to be shared with foreign governments. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think you've covered all of the questions. I mean, this was a really engaged group, which I think is a testament to your talk, Chap. And thank you so much for sharing this with us. I just want to say before everyone leaves, because I know everyone has to often leave right at the top of the hour, do watch your inboxes for information about a February talk by Michel Rio from the University of Montreal on digital trade in USMCA. And in March, we'll be having Paul Stockton to talk about critical infrastructure and more talks to follow after that. So let me just close by again thanking Chap for an excellent talk, and thank you all for attending today. It's been an excellent turnout and a lot of great questions.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Chap.
Thanks, Tom. We'll talk to you later. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.